Welcome back to the channel. So a number of you have sent me this story, so I thought I would cover it. So the Birmingham Mail reports that a driver says that they paid for a parking space and on arrival it didn't exist. In other words, there was no parking space available when they arrived, only then to find that they were hit with a parking charge notice, which in the article it's referred to as a fine, which is an interesting point because many people refer to these as a fine because it looks like a fine, it feels like a fine, most people think it's a fine and therefore they call it a fine. However, it's not a fine, it's a parking charge notice, it's an invoice. The difference between the two, which I'll address first, is really significant because a fine is something that has much more serious consequences if you fail to pay. Whereas a parking charge notice is the equivalent of an invoice for administrative charges for breach of contract. Now, that can only really be enforced by them taking you to court and proving to a judge that there was breach of contract and that you should pay this admin fee as a parking charge notice because you were in breach of contract. However, in cases such as this, the claim for breach of contract because you parked outside the lines or in the wrong place or overstayed or something like that, perhaps can be counteracted by the claim that they sold you a space which in fact didn't exist. So perhaps they were in breach of contract in the first place. Now, strictly speaking, they probably shouldn't have parked there at all because there wasn't a designated parking space when they arrived. So perhaps, in fact, they should have parked somewhere else and then sued the car park, which was NCP, for breach of contract. Now, NCP, which many of you will be aware, is the UK's largest private long-standing car park provider, which means it's not a fine, it's a parking charge notice. Now, this is a distinct difference because a private company has no official right to fine you. They can invoice you for breach of contract. However, I think this would be an interesting conversation with the judge when they accuse you of breach of contract, having sold you a space online beforehand which didn't exist when you arrived. In essence, they'll be accusing you of breach of contract by not parking within the designated bays, even though they sold you a bay which didn't exist when you arrived. But in any event, strictly speaking, you shouldn't be parking outside of the designated bays because that's not where you're supposed to park. Anywhere else would be in breach of contract. That would place you as the driver in breach of contract, although that is a little bit absurd. But nonetheless, on a strict analysis, you should park elsewhere. And in fact, you might well then have a claim against NCP for failure to provide the parking space that you've paid for. And if, let's say, your alternative parking is 3, 4, 5, 10 times as much, those are costs incurred as a result of breach of contract because they failed to provide the space that they charged you for in the first instance. So whilst this of course cannot be legal advice and cannot and must not be taken as legal advice, if this were me in this scenario, had I pre-booked a space with a car park and then I turned up and it didn't exist, I wouldn't park anywhere outside of a designated bay. I would find somewhere else to park, pay for whatever parking was necessary, even if it was more than the one that I paid for. Then I would go back to the company that I paid for the parking with and say, A, I want a refund of the amount that I paid, and if I had to pay more, I want that as well, because you're in breach of contract, because you contracted to me a parking space which didn't exist on arrival. Now, if as a result of that breach of contract by the parking provider, I had to incur additional expenses, even if that were parking miles away and getting additional transport in, I would be claiming for all of those fees because I've contracted for this parking space in this car park, which ultimately didn't exist. So I would then have incurred fees additional as a result of breach of contract. So that's what I would be claiming in that scenario. So ultimately what may well happen is some car parks may charge for spaces that they know don't exist or won't exist when they arrive because people coming in on the fly will take those spaces up and such that the car park is full on arrival for those that have paid for these tickets. Query, how many people, and you might let me know in the comments, how many people have been in this position where you've paid for a parking space and then you arrive to park, but there is simply nowhere to park? What do? Do you simply ask for a refund? Have you parked elsewhere? Have you also double parked and you've received a parking charge notice as a result? But follow-up question, how many people would actually decide to take this parking company to court for all of the additional costs that they've incurred as a result of what I say might well be a breach of contract by this parking company for failure to make this space available because it's been paid for in advance? Now, some car parks, now this is not a sponsored video for all you keyboard warriors out there, I know what you're like. This is not a sponsored video, but B4, as in Bravo numeral 4 car park in Birmingham, is where I often park. If you do book a space with them, the space actually alerts every other driver to the fact that this is a reserved space. Do not park here. Now, whilst admittedly some drivers might just ignore that and park there anyway, but then they'd be in breach of contract and so on. But ideally, people would obey that sign to say this parking space has been booked and not park there. So when you arrive, you have a pre-booked parking space. So as I said, not a sponsored video, although sponsorships welcome. But anyway, these are available. Some parking companies do make this clear that you can book the space, and then they make it clear to any other driver that the space is booked. But either way, on the face of it, I thought that this story was quite ridiculous. Issuing a parking charge notice to someone because they parked adjacent to a parking space because there was no space available, even though they'd prepaid for one. Strictly speaking, they should have done what I said in this video, but at the same time, the car park should see common sense and not have issued the parking charge notice in the first place. I'd welcome your thoughts and comments and discussion in the comment section below. Please like and subscribe to the video, and thank you all for 140,000 subscribers. I do have a big thanks to Legal Bytes for having me on their channel yesterday. For 7 hours, I believe I was on their live stream for. It was great fun. I hope some of you joined us. I know that some of you did. And I am in fact thinking of doing a regular live stream. Don't hold me to it just yet, but maybe during the day, maybe during the evening for a regular legal chat, maybe even a phone in. Who knows where this might go. The new legal TV of the UK by the Black Belt Barrister. Let me know what you think about that in the comments below. Make sure you subscribe if you think that's a good idea. Maybe even join as a channel member so you can tell me that you think that's a good idea. And as always, thank you for watching.